So injuries are going to happen, right? Well, who could we see from Iowa to fill various spots on the Wild roster? We'll discuss today on Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild. Your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the course of the week. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, Wyatt Garin joins us as we discuss some names from the Iowa Wild that we may see depending on the severity of injuries that the Minnesota Wild face this season. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. If this is your first time tuning into Locked on Wild, we welcome you on board. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. If you are one of the everydayers who tunes in each and every day of the week, glad to have you back. And speaking of glad to have back, Wyatt Garin joins us once again here today, and we're going to talk about some of those maybe not quite household names, but players on the Iowa Wild roster that we may see if everything goes wrong on the NHL roster, because injuries are going to happen. That's just a fact of life. And so you're really only as good as the players that you have at your disposal to call up and fill in various spots. And Wild are not doing too bad in that regard. So Wyatt, welcome in. How are things going?
Good. How have you been? How's the summer been? It's been a while since
Fast.
we've talked. Yeah, for sure.
Fast summer. It's
How's the golf
it's already non-existent.
Oh.
So yeah, just grinding away in the lab and getting us through boot camp. So it's okay. I haven't had really many birdies on the golf course, but plenty of birdies in the podcast studio. So
yeah, there you go.
we like that. And so you had posed this topic, and I think it's a good one because there are going to be some names that are going to need to help this roster at various points throughout the year. And so let's just go through. We'll talk about some names, kind of where they potentially could fit in the lineup, and we'll start on the offensive end. So you throw me a name, and we'll just kind of let things rattle around as to where we could see them this year.
Yeah. So I mean, your three biggest, probably bubble guys in that forward group right now are probably uh Adam Beckman, Sammy Walker, and Marco Rossi. I think as of right now, there's probably one job between the three of them that they're all going to be fighting for, unless Bill Guerin sees a bigger role for Rossi this year, which it could be the plan, but they just haven't seen that at the NHL level from him yet. So I think those three guys are going to be fighting for an everyday role in the bottom six, and one of them will probably be in the press box.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. And I think at this point, the one that everybody kind of wants to see is Rossi get that spot,
For sure.
potentially on the third line. But I tell you the one that really intrigues me, and this is even above Sammy Walker, because we know you plug Sammy Walker in with Matt Boldy and Joel Eriksson Ek, and some good things are going to happen there. So we'll talk about him in a little bit. But the one that I think is most intriguing is Adam Beckman, because we haven't seen him a ton, but what we've seen at the NHL level, especially in playing like a fourth line role as he has, is a guy who he likes to shoot the puck, and that plays regardless of what else you're doing out there on the ice. And he did a lot of good in his spot fill-ins so far. Players that shoot the puck, shoot first, ask questions later, that kind of stuff translates at the NHL level. So
for
regardless of
sure.
if he makes the team or if he is kind of that first call up, I'm real intrigued to see what Adam Beckman has in store this year.
I think so too. I think you're going to see, I don't want to say 20 plus games, but I think his ceiling is about 20 games on the NHL roster this year, barring some terrible injury luck. But I do think he'll be getting in the mix for sure. He's a guy that's probably more suited to be on a third line scoring role, maybe even a second line role where they're playing more offense. Um, but I just don't see that opportunity happening for him this year unless he breaks out in a major way.
Yeah, because at this point, and this is perfect because this is our big theme this week, is just looking at the third line as we work our way up the lineup. You got two spots in the third line that are pretty set, pretty solid, pretty ready to go in Freddie Gaudreau and Marcus Foligno. And so you have those two guys, and depending on how things play out with that other spot, I mean, you've got Gaudreau who can be a center. He's perfectly fine in that capacity. But then if Rossi if he ends up making the team, you're going to have him as the center there. And
For
so then
sure.
you slide Gaudreau over to a wing. And so I think if you look at
To
those two
me,
components,
that's the spot that's up for grabs, is that third line role. Because I think
yeah,
the fourth line this year is going to be the Deweys and Maroon. I
yep.
think they're going to want to keep that together. They're going to want to get Maroon 65 plus games played this year. So I think really the one spot up for grabs is that open slot on the third line.
And what is the component that third line is missing right now is a little bit of a scoring touch. And
Yeah,
so,
they can take it any direction they want to go with it, really. If they want more of a third line grinding checking role, they can do that. I think Beckman and Walker are both good fits for a third line scoring role. So it's all about what Dean wants. And I mean, just knowing how his style is, I think he likes to keep it a tight checking line
yeah,
versus if he had to pick between a scoring and a checking third line, he's going checking.
I agree. Now, I'm going to hit you with this for how scenarios play out. So let's say you have an injury to Ryan Hartman. I think, and we're not talking like one game. I'm talking about
Multiple games.
you're going to miss a week or two
Yeah.
to where you would need to make a move
Week to a month,
yeah,
that type of injury.
that sort of time frame to where you would need to make a move to bring somebody up. I think in these instances, and this is not, I'm just going to say it right now. This is not what I want necessarily, but just trying to read the tea leaves as to what's going to happen. I think if there's any sort of an injury to Ryan Hartman, I think Freddie Gaudreau gets moved up to that top line center, and you bring somebody up to play in a third line type role.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there because they lose anyone in the top six. They can't be going for more truculence. They need to bring guys in for scoring. Who was the GM that said that they traded? Was that the Maple Leafs GM back in the day? We need to trade for truculence.
Truculence. Okay,
Is that the joke? Like that's the Was it the Maple Leafs? I don't know. They signed some guy for truculence. That's what it was described as.
that's my new favorite word of all time. Like
I need to find this now.
bar none. Yeah, we'll try to get some context linked because that's the first time I've
Yeah.
ever heard that phrase used. But I'm also now obsessed by it. So
The only time I've ever heard it used is in hockey.
unbelievable. So that's I think what I see
It
happening
was
with
Brian Burke when he was the GM.
okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense. That makes sense.
I don't know who he was saying it about just off a quick Google search, but
Boy, it's a visual it's a visual descriptor,
yeah.
to say the least. So I think if Hartman goes down, you move somebody up. If Zuccarello sustains an injury of any sort, then you maybe look at bumping Johansson up there and you bring Walker up to play on the second line.
Right.
Something along those lines. And if Kirill sustains an injury, you
If
pray.
Kirill or Boldy go down, it's you're treading water basically.
You pray and you pray some
You're
more.
hoping to go 500 in that time.
So then on the second line, if Johansson gets injured, then Walker, I think, is your call up there.
For sure.
To add a similar component. It's all about adding similar components to what the players in those spots currently do. So I think we'll see Walker.
I mean, there's a couple other guys too that you might see come up. Like I know Nick Patan is still around, and they like him in spot starts. They signed Vinny Lettieri, who has a little bit of NHL experience. I think he'll be down in Iowa most of the year, but he'll definitely get a game or two in. And then you even got a guy like or two guys like Nick Swaney and Damian Giroux, who had NHL debuts last year. That that it's a good spot, I think, for the forward depth for the Wild right now.
Yeah, they've got plenty of names that could fill in if needed, to where you're not
panicking in
correct.
Yeah,
and you've got guys that can replicate similar skill sets depending on where in the lineup you sustain an injury. So
exactly.
From that standpoint, I think things are pretty set. I would think that Beckman, Walker are probably your first lines of assistance. Again, depending on who ends up getting that third line spot,
right?
Whether it's Rossi or not, or any of those guys.
I mean, the hope is that it's Rossi this year. That's the goal.
100%. Now on defense, it's a little more interesting because you have depth.
Well, we have a situation right now on defense in Kalen Addison where is he still they tendered him RFA or whatever that is. Yeah, but he hasn't signed it.
Correct.
Right. So he's technically unsigned right now. But the only way he would not play for the Wild next year is if he signed a offer sheet with another team, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that sounds correct.
That's there's that whole situation. Then there's the whole question of, well, if he signs, is he going to finally be a productive member of the full-time defense?
Yeah, let's dive into that a little bit after the break, because there are a couple of different ways that could go down. And so we'll talk defense and kind of what that looks like depending on injuries and so on as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wilds after this. Football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long. Because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win during the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory. You can also bet with your bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. If you are feeling a big season from Justin Jefferson, you can hammer the over on receiving yards, Kirk Cousins stats as well. There are plenty of different ways you can go at FanDuel Sportsbook. And if you want to put a little bit on the Minnesota Vikings to win the Super Bowl, why not? It's going to happen some year, so might as well just be one of the people that gets it right for the first time ever. So head to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, FanDuel.com/lockedon. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Seth Topol joined by Wyatt Garin. Let's dive in a little bit to the defense, because as you alluded to, Kalen Addison has not accepted the tender yet, and so technically is not signed. I would imagine that gets done at some point. But then that leaves an interesting question, because you've still got Jon Merrill, you've still got Alex Goligoski, And if you put Kalen Addison into that mix, you've got 6 chairs with 7 players. So
Are you counting
ultimately,
Brock Faber there?
yes.
Okay, because that was the question I was gonna ask. Is that 6 chairs and 7 guys counting Brock Faber or not? Because I think you have to count him in.
100%.
Yeah,
You go, I think your pairings stay relatively similar. Spurgeon, Middleton, lock it in. You can chisel that one into a brick because I don't think that one's going to change.
I'd really
Now,
like to see Brodin and Faber as a pair this year.
that's the interesting thing is because it seems like that is what we're going to get. But then you're dealing with some of those third line issues again, to where if you want to help Kalen Addison along a little bit more, do you put him up with Jonas Brodin so that he can cover a little more ground? Or do you just play your top 2 pairings? Do you play them like 28 minutes a night?
It's a tough question because you'd love to see Addison finally take that last step forward, because every year it's just seemed like he's been this close to being
Mhm.
really, really good. Like, you see it on the power play when he's running it, you see it when he's in the offensive zone. If he could just play semi-moderate defense, this guy would be so good, and we haven't seen that yet. Pairing him with Brodin might hide those deficiencies, but I think this is a guy that's got to earn his way onto that pairing, in my opinion.
And I think that top 4 then has potential to be real good because we're
If
also
that's how it plays out, it'll be a real good top 4 and a shaky bottom 6.
yeah, because who then is the other, who do you put on that other spot on that pairing? I mean, Jon Merrill has had adventures, to
Yeah,
say
to
the
say yeah,
least.
that's putting it lightly sometimes.
And it seems like if
I
you
love Alex
go,
Goligoski, but it's
well,
just time, man. It's just time.
he seems like too, he gets to a certain number of games and that's it. Like you hit the wall and then you just kind of free
Well,
fall off
what is
the
he now?
cliff.
38, 39? Like,
Yeah,
he's old.
38.
Is
Yeah.
You just can't he can't do an 82 game season again.
No, which is why I think he needs to be the injury fill in.
I think so too. But then you get into that whole what happened last year when he was pissed because he wasn't getting playing time, and I don't know if that affected the locker room or not. Like,
Yeah, it's not great. And
because you feel for the guy. Like, I get it, still wants to
right.
play all this and that, but he's sometimes just actively hurting the team.
Yeah, and clearly just does not have um enough in the tank to make it through an entire season.
No,
So
not at all.
I think it's pretty set that he's like if you're gonna lose um if you're gonna lose Spurgeon for a game or two, you bump him up in the lineup, and that's about all you can do because
Right?
that pairing. Ironically enough, the pairing of Dumba and Goligoski last year when Brodin was injured,
Yeah.
statistically they did okay. So it's not like he can't handle in spurts a little higher spot in the lineup. It's just when you throw him in for like 20 games in a row,
Right.
just not
Well,
not that same
he
guy.
was never a Nick Lidstrom to begin with. He was always, even at his prime, he was like an offensive guy. So
Right.
uh,
And
I
at
just
the
don't. I can't see them doing another full season of Goligoski getting more than 30 games.
yeah, no, I don't think so. Now, in terms of players down at the Iowa level who could hop up on defense, this is where it gets a little more interesting because there would have to be a couple of injuries that take place in order to
For
see some of
sure.
these guys.
The
But
other thing is too is it's more than likely going to be new faces, guys that are
yeah,
going to debut. I'm not sure, is Mermis still signed? I'm unsure of that or
I
not.
believe so.
Well, if he is, he would probably be one of the first guys up in a spot start situation.
Yeah.
A long-term injury, we could be looking at a couple of guys, Damon Hunt and Ryan O'Rourke, who these were early mid-round picks a couple of years ago. No NHL experience yet, but a lot of scouts have raved about both of these guys as potential NHL pairings in the future.
Yeah. And you've got some other guys that are getting closer, not quite ready yet. Carson Lambos, Kyle
That was the other
Master.
name I was gonna mention was Lambos. I'm not sure if he has another year to go back to major junior. I don't know how old he is off the top of my head, but I know he's signed. So if that's the case and he doesn't make the full-time NHL team and he has year eligibility, he will be back in juniors.
So there are some options
Right.
depending on what you need, but I think the defense is a little more set than the offense is in terms of players on the roster that
Yeah.
are not playing that will if somebody gets hurt. Now,
We've had a logjam of defensemen for a little bit,
yeah.
so the loss of Matt Dumba, that's going to bump everyone up one spot, basically.
Mm-hmm. Now the goalie situation is interesting. So we'll finish by discussing that because fewer names and one in particular that I think is knocking on the door. So we'll discuss Jesper Wallstedt as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, tune in tomorrow as we start diving into third line players. We'll do a preview for Steady Freddie Gaudreau to start things off this week. So you can tune in for that coming up tomorrow here on Locked On Wild. Expectations, stats, what do we need from Freddie Gaudreau, all coming up on tomorrow's episode. Finishing our chat with Wyatt Garin here today. Wyatt, let's talk goalies because you've got Filip Gustavsson locked in. Marc-Andre Fleury in the final year of his deal, likely final year of his career, potentially. So who do we see if somebody gets hurt?
Well, the easy answer is Wallstedt. This guy it took him a sec to get warmed up to the North American game, but man, he was unbeatable after about 10 games in the AHL. He just looked like the best goalie not in the NHL at the moment. So you'd think it'd be him, but the more and more I thought about this, Bill Guerin has been very adamant about not rushing Wallstedt, about letting him basically overbake in the AHL. They want to make sure they don't do anything to screw with his development. And we've seen that lately. I think there's been a push to try to get try to get goalies into the NHL at a younger and younger level, and it just doesn't seem to be a position that works a lot of the time. Carter Hart came in very young, and he's had a lot of ups and downs. More recently, Spencer Knight came in very young, and he's had ups and downs. So, in my opinion, I think we will see the debut of Wallstedt this year, but I would not count on it. By debut, I mean he's going to sit on the bench 1 or 2 games. I would be shocked if he actually got in a game because they've been adamant about overbaking him. So
Yeah.
that's where I think they're at with him. But I mean, it also wouldn't shock me if he played, I guess. So
Yeah, it depends. It depends on what happens because, again, you can kind of get by with one goalie depending on for a game or two because of how far games are spread out now. You've usually got a day or 2 days in between games. The Wild don't have a ton of back-to-backs, at least early on. They have a couple, but they don't have a ton of them until later on in the season. And so if you have an injury to where Gustafsson's going to miss a week or Fleury's going to miss a week, those are 2 guys that are capable of
playing a week in a row.
of playing that starter's workload, where then you can just bring somebody up to be the backup,
Emergency situation backup.
Yeah, Zane McIntyre somewhere in that. The Wild had a couple of instances last year in which they had to do that. Filip Gustavsson got sick for a couple of games, and so
and
had to have kind
Zane
of that
was up. Yep.
emergency. Yeah. So
They've always been very good about having that kind of journeyman up and down guy, and that's been Zane McIntyre the past few years, which is good. I think teams are smart to do that because you really never know when you need a guy with even a little NHL experience not crapping his pants in there when he
Yeah,
needs.
and somebody who is ready to hop in at a moment's notice,
Right.
and is not going to be rattled by being a young player and, hey, you're the backup. Oh, actually, wait, now you're going to get the start tonight.
Right.
So,
and I guess the only other interesting name we have in the organization right now is Hunter Jones, who was drafted, if I'm not mistaken, he was like a second round pick a few years ago.
Mhm.
He was pretty high. And I know last year he got majority of his starts at the ECHL level.
Correct.
But he wasn't terrible. So, it's another case of, well, now will the tandem be him and Wallstedt in Iowa this year, and then what happens to Zane McIntyre? So that's kind of the wild card in this is him, because the Wild obviously saw something in him if they took him in the second round,
Yeah.
especially for a goaltender, because that just usually doesn't happen.
Yeah, and so you've got, as we've laid out, you have plenty of names who could see some time at the NHL level, depending on the severity of injury, type of injury, spot in the lineup. And so we're going to, as these next couple of seasons go along, we're going to see some of that highly rated prospect pool start to flex its muscles a little bit. And that can only be a good thing for where this team wants to go and kind of what they're dealing with over the next 2 years. So you hope you don't need those guys, but it's always nice to have them in the event that you inevitably do. Because again, let's be honest,
In
injuries
case of
happen.
emergency, break glass.
Exactly. Well, that is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Again, thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you have not already, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so that we can get to 2,000 subscribers before the start of the season. Make sure to leave a 5-star review on either Apple or Spotify. We appreciate that as well. And we'll continue to guide you through the rest of the offseason here with Locked On Wild Boot Camp. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.